All right, well, we get started. My name is Emerson Baker. Everyone knows me as Tad. I'm the Interim Dean of Graduate and Continuing Education at Salem State University, but my day job really is being a professor of history and public historian at Salem State. And so today what I really want to talk to you about is being my most current research in an exhibit that I just put together, actually, that just ended after a couple of years. Which also, too, turned out to be a shameless promotion for my new book, which is the exhibit catalog. And I'll manage to make shameless plugs for my other two books along the way, I promise. So anyhow, this is my research for the past quarter century has been on what I call the other New England. And that, in fact, there are really a couple of different New Englands. And in particular, this is the exhibit that I most recently did with Nina Maurer at Old Berwick Historical Society in South Berwick, Maine, that explores the Piscataqua region in the 17th century as an example of that other New England. Because, in fact, I live in York, Maine, and work at Salem State University. So I drive those two green bridges, as we know them, every day across the Piscataqua and then one across the Merrimack. And honestly, folks, once you get across those two bridges, things are really different. It's a different New England, right? I call it the other New England. And it's always been that way since the 17th century. And so that's what this exhibit and this project, and frankly, most of my research has been in the past 25 years or so. Start off with just, let's put it this way, Puritan New England. It's really annoying me as a concept. I apologize, Frank. The world's leading expert on John Winthrop, and you're saying you don't like the idea of Puritan New England. That's probably not a good way to make friends, but Frank, fortunately, he's already a friend. So here's the thing. Puritan New England was none of the above, right? There were other places than Massachusetts Bay in Connecticut. There's Mason's Pat in New Hampshire and the province of Maine, which were very, very different places. And if I get this to, there we go. Not Puritan. Anglicans, Baptists, Quakers, Muggletonians even, we'll talk about that, and godless fishermen. Matter of fact, Antinomians and others who were kicked out of Massachusetts, where did they end up? New Hampshire and Maine. Exhibit A, Reverend John Wheelwright, right? As one leading Puritan magistrate called Maine, a harbor for all the rogues in the country, complaining that if we don't throw the Quakers out of Maine, God help us, all of New England is going to be lost. Not new, right? Native Americans have occupied the area for at least 10, 11, 12,000 years. Frankly, from time immemorial in their term, which some historians have trouble with, but I find it no more difficult a concept than the idea that the natives signed away their rights and are subjects of the king. They're both statements of sovereignty, right? Well, anyhow, we all know the natives have been here wicked long, as we say up north. And not England. Good God, no. I mean, look at the other people aside from the Native Americans who are around here. African slaves, and in Maine particularly, we have lots of Scottish prisoners of war, Irish indentured servants, people from throughout Europe. It really was an Atlantic diverse community in the 17th century, just like today, right? Exhibit A here, the McIntyre garrison on the York River in the Scotland district, built by a son of one of those Scottish prisoners of war. So to give you a little sense of this, let's start with a story which actually takes place on Great Island, now Newcastle, New Hampshire, but in the 17th century, this was part of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And start with a shameless plug for yet another one of my books. All of my books are for sale downstairs. George and Alice Walton were Quakers. And George first came to Exeter as an Antinomian in 1638 with Reverend John Wheelwright. He and his wife Alice run a debauched Quaker tavern, which is supernaturally assaulted by flying stones throughout the summer of 1682. This is not a novel. A friend of mine said, "Tad, this is a great novel." I said, "No, you flatter me. It's history. This actually happened." Well, what about a debauched Quaker tavern? That seems a bit odd. Well, this tavern was complaints were constantly brought up against it, against drunken sailors from all over the world who were carrying on in the tavern. The Native American household servant, Mary Agawam, who commits fornication with some foreign sailor on the Sabbath in the tavern, resulting 9 months later in the birth of her bastard son, William, who works in the tavern. One of the Walton grandchildren drowned in an open well in the backyard. It's the center of royalist opposition of northern New England against Massachusetts Bay. As I say in one of the chapters of this book, these were the neighbors from hell. And they were supernaturally possessed as well, too, because once their tavern is assaulted, they accused their widowed elderly next-door neighbor, Anglican widow, Hannah Jones, of being the witch. She was up to the challenge. She immediately charged George with being a wizard, sort of a cross-charge. But it basically was all over this, a 25-year property dispute between the two families. By a couple acres of like marshland, which sort of then is now, though coastal land in New England is worth fighting over. But this is a story that includes all kinds of diverse characters as well. It includes one of the other neighbors, John the Greek Amazine, AKA John the Italian Amazine, which means he probably was an Italian national who lived of Greek heritage, living in one of the Greek enclaves in southern Italy. And so after about a month, this lithobolia incident appears to sort of strangely spread upriver, and it ends up settling in at the home of, see, we start up here from Great Island, and we go upriver to Berwick, Maine, to the home of Antonio Hurtado, who's from Fayal in the Azores, and his wife, Mary, is the daughter of an Anglican West Country fisherman. Others in the story is the Walton's Irish servant Dermot O'Shea or O'Shaw, fishermen from the Orkney Islands, the Channel Islands, people who speak Gaelic and French, and Reverend William Scriven and other Baptists. You haven't heard me use the word Puritan here, have you? And you have witchcraft here, and there's no spectral afflictions and writhing girls on the floor. And yes, I apologize for that on the TV show last week. It was a little excessive. But here's the point. This was 17th century New England, yet you've heard none of this in any textbook, I doubt, right? But this is what the real New England was really like. That isn't saying there weren't lots of Puritans from East Anglia, but here we're talking about Englishmen from the West Country and other places who are Anglicans or godless fishermen. And it's a very different place, right? And also, yeah, those Scots prisoners of war. Fascinating, fascinating, fascinating. After the Battle of Dunbar in Worcester, 1 year apart to the day, known as Cromwell's crowning glory, right, Worcester. 400 of these guys are shipped to Massachusetts, forced into forced labor for terms of 5 to 8 years, never to return to England. Many of them end up in Maine in places like the Scotland district, right? Lumbering and then farming. So this is what we're talking about. It's a very different place. This is the other New England. I first got into this almost by accident. What was supposed to be a day-and-a-half teacher workshop to see if we could locate a 17th century site, and it kind of became like the 3-hour tour of historical archaeology that went on for 13 years and that I've been doing ever since. So I will orient you to the archaeology dig and how that fits into the current project, but this is the Piscataqua and the Scott map of about 1665. Notice here, this map was drawn because of to show where all the sawmills of the region were, because this was, the Piscataqua in northern New England was the economic engine where the lumber and the cod were gathered that New England got rich on, right? And this is why the Puritan merchants are moving into this region and actually taking over New Hampshire and Maine in the 1640s and 1650 is to get those resources and be able to export them out of the region. So we're gonna go up here to what's now South Berwick, Maine, originally part of the town of Berwick, and this is where the Chadbourne site is located, where we dug for 13 years, stopped in 2004, because basically we already had about 40,000 artifacts and started studying this stuff. The site was destroyed in the Salmon Falls raise of 1690, so it's an archaeological time capsule, truly a remarkable site. And so I was introduced almost by accident to this amazing archaeology site and the amazing family who lives there. And ever since then, I've been trying to tell their story in public talks. And I said, we're gonna put out an exhibit catalog, which I got. So now the next part is to write that sort of material culture history of northern New England in the 17th century from the viewpoint, really, of the Piscataqua and that forgotten frontier, as opposed to this sort of traditional New England begins, Boston sort of focused looking outward. We're gonna be outward and look kind of inward and look south. So This is the Chadbourne site, excavations from 1995 to 2007. This is roughly what we think the house looked like. And we could talk about the archaeology and architecture of this for a long, long time. But what I really want to do is talk today about people. When we first were putting together this project a few years ago, and got together a grant, and we were able to bring in people like Laurel Ulrich and Jeff Bolster and Richard Candy together to talk about what kind of exhibitor project we should do. And Laurel, as I knew she would say, said, it's got to be microhistory. It's got to be focused on people. People want to hear stories about people. So our exhibit here is sort of an attempt to talk about the forgotten frontier, the lost 17th century in northern New England, and to tell that from the point of view in particular of 8 individuals. And the cool thing here is most of these 8 individuals are sort of either physically related or related by history. So we start off with a story about Sagamore Rowles, who's the Native American Sagamore, who in this deed here actually sells a huge parcel of land to Humphrey Chadbourne, who will build his house on the site. Rowles is a really interesting guy, and there's a really interesting relationship, I think, between he and Chadbourne. For one, he's referred to in the deed as Mr. Rowles, which is a tremendous statement of respect. Not everybody was a Mr. in the 17th century, as we know, right? We were good man and good wife, but not Mr. So clearly, there's I think a sign of mutual respect between the two. By the way, Lisa Brooks was our advisor for the Native American part of the project as well, too, and it was just wonderful to be able to work with her as well. So we start telling the story about Native American-European interaction and trade and Sagamore Rowles and Humphrey Chadbourne. And then we focus in on Humphrey Chadbourne, and here's his probate inventory. When he died in 1667, he left an estate of 1,713 pounds. You know, when I started talking about him 10, 15 years ago, I referred to him as the Donald Trump of Maine. I don't do that anymore. But realize that the average estate at this time is about 200 pounds, right? This guy's super rich. And he has a sawmill. He has all sorts of other stuff, including 5 serving men and maids. By the prices, they are actually indentured servants, I'm pretty sure. But after Humphrey dies and his wife remarries, in her second husband's will, it does actually mention ye negro. So the family did own, and the value was higher, it's like 40 pounds, so it was definitely a slave. So these folks, if you're running lots of sawmills and lumbering operations, you need forced labor. You need cheap labor, right? Be it Scots prisoners of war, or when they become free, maybe I think that's when you go and start getting slaves, right? Because you need the next generation of slave labor. And if you look at when most of the slaves start showing up in New England, really, it's like that third quarter 17th century when you start to see numbers. And I think that's related to the fact that the damn Scots, they've become free. Who can we pick on next, right? The Chadbourne site, we found huge amounts of lumber, related hardware and sawmill hardware. This is a stirrup from a sawmill. We found a pair of them. We found a huge scrap pile of iron that I think we probably spent about $30,000 conserving, because when you find a rusty pile of iron, you have to conserve it. In this case, it was, I went to my friends at the Saugus Ironworks and said, okay, what is all this stuff? I think it's a sawmill. They said, great, we've never seen anything like that, because 17th century sawmills get washed away by floods and the hardware disappears. So we're still trying to sort it out, but we also too have a 5-foot-long section, an almost complete pit saw, which unfortunately, once you conserve it, looks a little more like Swiss cheese, right? But you could actually use a pit saw blade temporarily as a replacement for a regular saw blade, but in this case, I think one reason this thing ends up looking like a pretzel is because it probably just wasn't up to the wear and tear of the mill. So the Chadbournes and their family and friends and relatives just made a fortune on the lumber industry, carrying out what Jeff Bolster has called the first clear cut, right? I mean, if we think clear cutting is old, it's new, it's something very, very old. It's been going on since the first generation or two of settlers here. The Chadbourne site just amazed me, and it's sort of a great site to focus an exhibit around. And in large part, what we did was we only had artifacts from a couple of different archaeology sites, but we managed to spread all those artifacts out around all the individuals in the exhibit, sort of sharing the wealth. But in this case, we kept like one of the prizes right with the Chadbournes. This is a Hull and Sanderson spoon, right, one of 8 known to exist by the first American silversmiths that we found in the burnt-out rubble of the house because the Chadbournes hadn't even bothered to go back to get it. Right, that when the house burned down in 1690, what's a silver spoon, right? And you can see here Here's the I.H. John Hull and Robert Sanderson as well. And there's the initials H.L.C., Humphrey and Lucy Chadbourne. And I'll tell you, when I was able to take that spoon and walk over to a 10th generation descendant and hand it to him, that was pretty powerful. It really was. Archaeologists like to work with descendant populations. In this case, we work with the Chadbourne Family Association, which is a bit odd because usually when they talk about descendant populations, you're talking about native indigenous, and in this case. But they understood, and they were the ones that would help pay for the money to conserve the objects, right? So anyhow, all kinds of amazing stuff that the Chadbournes used as status markers, because when you have slaves, when you have indentured servants and the Scottish and these other folks, you want them to know who you are and who they are. And when I was in grad school, I didn't believe this nonsense about status in archaeology, frankly. And because I said, well, you know, when my wife and I got married, we picked out our China pattern. We're only doing this once, right? And thank God, 36 years later, right, still married. I don't know how she puts up with me, but that's another. You hear that, Peg? Seriously, we don't think as much about status and things like ceramics, I think, now as they did then, because, well, you know, we're just going to go to, well, okay, Jordan Marsh, right? Pick out a pattern. Right? These folks, everything was meant to push that status. It absolutely was. So the Chadbournes had the latest fashionable ceramics. When this place burned in 1690, most of the ceramics in use dated to like the late 1680s, early 1690s. New fashions like the brand new Chinese scholar pattern, which is what we would now recognize as the forerunner of chinoiserie, right? That first wave of Chinese influence. Or blue Persan, which is, it's an English imitation of a French imitation of Persian porcelain, right? Very, very high-end sort of stuff. Or even, how about imported stuff from way far away, like Oseo polychrome ware from Mexico City? Took me forever to get this stuff identified. It absolutely did, because no one had really seen it before. These are the first known examples of Mexican-made wares found north of the James River, actually, right? I think there's a lot more out there in our collections, folks, that we pass off as French or Dutch or Guadalupe ware or something like that. Nope, this is the real McCoy, and this is what a plate of it looks like, and that's from the Florida Museum of Natural History. Bold, garish stuff. And this was not a souvenir. They had a full plate, a set of at least 4 different plates, or platas, as we know, right? So these are the kind of people, like imagine, you know, you go over to Hump and Lucy's for dinner, and a set of that is laid out on the table. And the guests are going, wow, hey, Humphrey, is that what I think it is? Well, yes, it is. Where did you, we have our ways. We all know people like this, right? You want theirs? Well, I can't tell you. This is a status symbol. And it's if you think about it, it makes perfect sense it would be here, because these are lumber merchants shipping stuff to the Piscataqua, lumber and fish. To the west, out of the Piscataqua to the West Indies. Who else is in the Indies? The Spanish. Are you supposed to be trading with them? No. But we New Englanders, as we all know, have been really good smugglers since day one. Anyhow, so back to this network and this kinship, and you can see here all the people in red here are sawmill owners and sawyers, and you can see these people are all related to each other. So they're controlling, much like Bernard Bailyn looked like the New England merchants really of southern New England and how they're all connected. These folks were too within a couple of generations. So there's Humphrey and Lucy, and fascinating family. Lucy's family is so wealthy they come over in their own ship from England, and they named the town of Kittery after their estate on the Dart River, Kittery Court. So again, he married very well for a poor carpenter, and also his sister becomes his next door neighbor, Patience Spencer Chadbourne, or Chadbourne Spencer. Now, interesting thing here, Patience and her husband are, yes, Quakers. And this, again, is a sort of symbol of all kind of the divided loyalties you have in Maine in the 17th century, all as these artifacts from the site, from the Chadbourne site, demonstrate, where we have the Chadbournes. Humphrey Chadbourne is a representative to the general court. It's a Puritan merchant, that's for sure, right? But Lucy's uncle, Nicholas Shapley, is another Quaker. He's the leader of the royalist cause in Maine, and on the site we found all these darn Tudor rose medallions and harness bosses, which is a badge of loyalty to the crown, not to Massachusetts, right? I mean, the Chadbourne site, we find the oak tree 2-pence. There's Massachusetts. But there's also the royalist impulse. And by the way, don't think you're too safe here, because there's also the Wabanaki and the French Catholics to the north who eventually destroyed the site in 1690, right? So just in a couple artifacts, you can kind of tell that story of how troubled and divided the northern New England is in the 17th century. So Patience Spencer and Thomas Spencer, her husband, Nicholas Shapley, part of an extended network of Quakers in the Piscataqua in the 17th century. And yet again, just like the Waltons, the Spencers are tavern keepers. So it was really sort of fun to be able to introduce them and talk about, again, more sort of debauched taverns and just what Berwick, Maine would have looked like on a Saturday night in 1670, right? Where Daniel Goodwin confesses that he struck Humphrey Spencer on the head with a stool. The tavern keeper, Goodwin, wasn't too good about keeping track of it because he admitted he was drunk at the time. Two other men admitting they were at Gattonsby's Tavern on the Lord's Day at the time of the sermon. Nicholas Frost was so drunk that he confessed that he tried to stab himself with his knife, and he confessed he was so drunk he didn't remember it. And I'm going like, this stuff like it's like ripped from the headlines, right? Okay. And the court heard all these cases where? In the tavern. Now, interesting thing here again, Humphrey Spencer, yes, that is Humphrey Chadbourn's nephew. John Gattonsby is Patience's son-in-law. Daniel Goodwin, that's Mehitable Goodwin's father-in-law, the famous captive who we'll get to in a minute, because these people are all related. And this is the stuff they had, right? Again, this, if you look at Patience's probate inventory, it mentions 3 times Lisborne, Lisbon dishes. Lisborne tin enameled ware, Fianca. And this is what we find on the Chadbourne site and on other sites, and this is what it would have looked like. And it's when we found actually that the influence of Portugal and Portuguese ceramics and trade is really, really, really important in the 17th century. In pretty much every site we dig in the Piscataqua region, we see pieces of this stuff. Again, it looks like English delf. It is not. The patterns are distinct. We're just learning about this, really, from the work of Portuguese scholars. As my students know, I love probate inventories. Nicholas Shapley's probate inventory is amazing. It includes all kinds of cool stuff like, look at this. Right after the livestock come the slaves, worth 90 pounds, and then 2 Irish boys, great guns, 7 pounds, fowling pieces, 4 muskets. Well, again, by the way, folks, Quaker, but also, yes, major in command of the Yorkshire militia. Right? And it was before Quakers were pacifists. And also leading royalist of the region. Yeah, so Nicholas Shapley is our next character that we talk about. We actually have some pretty high-end stuff that we were able to borrow to show off his life. And the bottom line is that the royalists of New Hampshire and Maine are trying to keep independent of Maine and Massachusetts. And part of this is a religious dispute, right? Because the Quakers want religious freedom, so which the king wants, because the king really wants to be a Catholic, right? So Quakers and royalists, basically the friend of my enemy is my friend, right? All you people who are in favor of Massachusetts Bay, forget it. We want to drive Massachusetts out. This is the remains of the Shapley Mill in Elliott. You can see out here at low tide. You need someone to work that mill, so yep, let's get slave labor. One of his slaves was Black Will, who, when he was freed in 1700, becomes William Black. And this is another, a deed in the Suffolk deeds, actually, of Shapley buying another slave named Cuff in 1675, I believe it is. So again, I think we tend to think of slaves as being like household servants or working the fields. No, we're talking about sawmill workers and lumberjacks here, right? And in fact, in the exhibit, we talk about William Black and the fact that, interesting, before even he's able to become free in 1700, about 5 years earlier, he bought 100 acres of land. And so we portray him in our exhibit as the farmer. And while I really think little broken bits of artifacts are really cool, my curator, Nina Maurer, said, yeah, you know, Tad, not so much, most people, right? So we go with museum replicas like milk pans, one made by my good friend Martha Sellier, and Jeff Miller, who's an amazing historic blacksmith, who's, you know, you're not going to recognize that as a 17th century cowbell, Tad, I don't think. So we'll do a replica. And by the way, this cowbell is from the Hilton site, which is the home of Lucy Chadbourne's mother, who was married, her second husband was Edward Hilton, who's considered by most people to be the founder, if you will, the English founder of New Hampshire. So all of these people are all related. Oh, and yeah, they owned a sawmill too, right? So what time do we have till 11:30? Okay. Don't want to go over. All right, so back to the family. Interesting thing too, by the way, check this out. Thomas and Patience Spencer's granddaughter, Elizabeth Turbot, marries William Black Jr. So they really, literally are all related. Isn't that cool? Other folks involved too. Back to those Scottish prisoners. The Counting House Museum of the Old Berwick Historical Society in South Berwick is on the site, quite literally, of the home of Thomas Holmes, who was one of these Scottish prisoners who operated a sawmill at the falls where the Counting House Museum is. And in fact, actually, when they were putting a fish ladder in the river, some of the workers threw the spoon up to the president of the Historical Society, sort of just winged it and said, "You're looking for old stuff? Here's old stuff." We're like, "Oh my God!" It's a dog-nosed spoon. That's right. It dates to like 1690, probably, when the house was destroyed in the raid. So again, really, and we actually have worked really closely with the folks at Durham University. I was honored to go speak over there a couple years ago when they had a dedication ceremony for some of the victims of the Battle of Dunbar, whose mass grave they found actually on the Cathedral Close recently when they were putting in a new cafe for the university. So I think the next big project, too, that we'll undertake archaeologically, if I have it in me, is to be studying that Scottish frontier, if you will, and some of the sites that we have identified. And the influence of these guys is not minuscule. If you look at this list of households in Berwick in 1711, 25% of the surnames are Scottish prisoner sons and grandsons. This is a substantial part of the population, which, by the way, reflects the name of Berwick, which was the nearest English town and also the town closest to the Battle of Dunbar, and also New Hampshire, where Durham, New Hampshire, hence Durham Cathedral, where these guys were imprisoned as well, too. So all the pieces go together. And there's actually a recent book on this by the archaeologists of Durham that I highly recommend. Anyhow, this whole area was relatively peaceful, except for those tavern scuffles, until 1675 when King Philip's War broke out. And what's interesting, we actually figured out that the Chadbourne house was attacked in 1675 and defended. And the best way we know that is from a really obscure reference in Hubbard's History of the Indian Wars, but also, too, in these flattened musket balls, which is what happens when musket balls hit like palisades or wooden walls. They just flatten right out. Teeth marks, of course, you know where that comes from, right? Bite the bullet, quite literally. 17th century anesthesia. So anyhow, here's the thing. We call this a forgotten frontier because it really was on the biting, indeed bleeding edge of the frontier. Because it's a narrow line of settlement, one house is deep, and when you get to the end of the road in Berwick, the next European house is up on the St. Lawrence, right? So these are the people that are incredibly vulnerable to attack in King Philip's War and again in King William's War. And in fact, actually, King William's War hits this region, it desolates Maine, and frankly, I would say is the region why we have all this wonderful archaeological potential and why northern New England is the other New England, is that northern frontier, is because I can literally be standing in an abandoned 17th century cellar hole that is within sight of Interstate 1 and Interstate 95. And that in fact, the growth of northern New England was retarded by multiple generations by the destruction of these wars, right? Where people had to abandon and move south. And again, think about this, the Salmon Falls raid, just hitting them out in dawn, March 18th, almost there. We know what the weather's like, right? They came down on snowshoes from Canada, picked up local Wabanaki guides, and then just destroyed the community. Over probably 100 killed, 44 taken captive. Almost as, oh wait a second, I'm sorry, those are the Deerfield numbers. Our numbers weren't quite that bad. But about 100 killed or taken captive. And I actually have the Deerfield numbers there. That's what happens when you reuse slides, folks, right? Because the leader of the Deerfield raid was a young boy, Jean-Baptiste Hertel de Rouville, and he participated in the Salmon Falls raid with his father, Hertel, who led that raid. But Jean-Baptiste would learn these tactics of the dawn raid in winter on snowshoes, because that's exactly what he did in Deerfield in 1704. And in fact, Hertel was knighted by Louis XV in 1716 for his duties to the crown. And funny, here's the problem when you're trying to do 17th century, folks. This is the only one of the 8 people that we focus on in the exhibit who we actually have the photo for, right? The rest of them, we don't, or photo, image for. We don't know what the rest of them looked like. Though having said that, I was convinced grudgingly by my curator to use 17th century images, portraits from New England to represent them. But I always try to point out, we really have no idea what Humphrey Chadbourne looks like. But yeah, he would have dressed and kind of looked like John Freak, right? Anyhow, so that's one of the problems we have with the 17th century. We don't have those Kodak moments. We don't have even, Matthew Brady in photography. But I would argue that with the artifacts and the images that we do have, we can tell a pretty amazing story. So yeah, the late 17th century, I call it unsettling times, and I mean that in multiple ways, right? People were actually abandoned this region and made that frontier completely unpopulated really by Englishmen or by Native Americans. It wasn't safe to be there. So we kind of end the exhibit with 2 more, with Ertel and also Mehitable Goodwin, who's one of those captives. So captor and captive from the Salmon Falls raid, and what life would have been like for them, the hard trek down from Quebec, the hard trek back with lots of prisoners. In many cases, we know at Deerfield, they actually brought snowshoes for them to march back north on, and moccasins as well, right? After the raid, Berwick is largely abandoned, right? It really, and this is, you can see here this map of 1708. And you can see, yep, here's the Salmon Falls River, and yep, it kind of, no sense in showing anything up there because no one's living up there anymore. Only crazy people, and they'll gradually come in after Queen Anne's War in 1713 for the most part. Now, having said this, shameless plug for another book, but here's the thing. This warfare on the northern frontier is directly related to the Salem witch trials. And if you don't believe me, ask my good friend Marilyn Roach. And an example of this, one of the captives taken on the Salmon Falls raid, along with Mehitable Goodwin, is Mercy Short. And she's very, very famous in the Salem witch trials in 1692. She is forced marched to Quebec, probably watched her loses both of her parents and many of her siblings on the Salmon Falls raid, may well have watched them be killed. The house is burned down. She and the other neighborhood kids and others are marched north to Quebec, and she is probably forced to convert to Catholicism. We don't fully understand the mechanism of why some captives did. Mehitable Goodwin did as well too. May have gotten you kind of preferential treatment, or maybe you got to not work on the Lord's Day, right, and to attend worship. We're not entirely sure. But you can imagine to have a little Puritan girl. Well, I'm not sure, frankly. Honestly, Mercy Short was probably Quaker, but that's another story. Something I'm working on. But anyhow, to have a good Protestant girl being forced marched to Quebec and converting to Catholicism, and then she comes back to Boston. She's redeemed by William Phipps on his raid of Quebec in 1690. That's another book, but I won't mention it because it's out of print. Mercy Short is afflicted, right? A witch curses her in the Boston prison when Mercy's delivering food there to another prisoner. And she freaks out. What I would consider actually probably is a classic case of PTSD. And we know about her a lot because Cotton Mather was her minister, and he personally wrote at length about trying to save her. And he says, Mercy says that she was afflicted by and tempted by a black man. Because somebody would be like, well, what did Satan look like, and how did he tempt you? Well, she said Satan was a black man, which is a good English description of Satan at the time, which when we can get into all kinds of issues of race in the 17th century, or in some degrees lack of race, but understanding of other, right? I mean, other, and frankly, other could be slaves or Native Americans, or frankly, the Irish or the Scottish, right? And there's sort of a pecking order as to how you treat them. But anyhow, but no, not like a black man like Satan, but tawny, like an Indian. It's the way she describes Satan. And then she goes on to describe, essentially, he's wearing a high-crowned hat, which actually would fit very well with a Wabanaki high hat. So many other cases in this we can talk about. Again, take a look at some of my stuff, or Marilyn's or Mary Beth Norton's book. But if you read the Salem witch trials transcriptions, they're full of images to warfare, and garrisons and stuff like that, and attacks. Look at George Burroughs. One of his crimes is he supposedly can put his finger in a musket and lift it up like that, right? Anyhow, so there are real definite ties to that. If you realize that in a period of a couple of years, just before 1692, all of New England, pretty much north of Portsmouth, had been abandoned, right? Had been destroyed in these kind of morning raids on Pemaquid, on what's now Portland, on Wells, on York, on Salmon Falls, even down into New Hampshire, right? This was a scary time, and people didn't know if they were going to be next or not. All right, so back to the genealogy. So look at this network and this amazing family who it's really great to work with, this extended family. And it starts with Humphrey and Lucy Chadbourne. And just, I don't have time to talk about all these people, but for example, the Gilmans of Exeter, that's the Gilman garrison, for example, right? Historic New England folks. Royalists, Major Nicholas Shapley, we've talked about. Quakers, the Spencers, the Shapleys, and frankly others. Another one of the Chadbourne children who doesn't make this tree was a Quaker as well. Muggletonian, Richard Leader. Muggletonians are, again, one of these obscure Puritan offshoots during the English Civil War, where you basically have all these different Protestant sects. And the Muggletonians, again, were sort of a variation of millennialists. And they thought the group had become extinct, and then they found out that the last few actually lived until well into the 20th century, because it was a secret society. And you know, and I can't prove this, but I'm pretty sure, as you probably are too, right? This is where J.K. Rowling gets the word muggles. Yeah, right. So yeah, even these bizarre groups. And Baptists. So here's the thing, folks. Think about this. Baptists were so far out on a limb in 1682 that they were basically being warned out of Maine even. Wow. Yeah. What do you mean you don't baptize your youth? What happens when they die? Then they're going to go to hell. That's not good. Well, you know, it's a little different. You need to have some choice there in being an adult. Anyhow, interesting thing here. These folks, and again, the richest families of the region. Lucy Chadbourne's daughter by a second marriage, whose father owns a slave. Richard Cutts, the Cutts brothers are probably the richest men in New Hampshire. And they're becoming Baptists. One of the Cutts girls marries William Scriven. And then in the end, they just say, we're being hounded too much, we're leaving. So Scriven and a bunch of these folks pack up and move to Charleston, South Carolina, where Scriven is like the founder or one of the founders of Southern Baptism. So this is 17th century diverse New England, folks. Check this out, right? The Southern Baptist movement began in 1682 in Kittery Point, Maine. Okay? Where are those Puritans when you need them? So I hope you've enjoyed this somewhat different view of early New England. And again, you know, the catalog came out a couple months ago. It's only really available for me or the Old Berwick Historical Society, so I do have copies here. And I'd like to point out that the introduction is by my old friend Jeff Bolster, Bancroft Prize winner. We've got a wonderful essay on European Wabanaki relations by Bancroft Prize winner Lisa Brooks. And then I wrote the other essay, and yeah, still waiting on that Bancroft. Anyhow, thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah. Well, before what? How early do you want to say? Okay, so and this gets, and I've talked about this with Frank, right? We're getting ready to celebrate 400th anniversaries up there as well, too. And of course, we've already had the first, John Smith, who visited the Piscataqua in 1614. We know that there were probably seasonal fishermen on the Isles of Shoals by 1616, or earlier even. We also know that Damascove, probably even earlier than that, maybe by 1610, 1612. We know that there was the first year-round fishing station at Panaway Plantation at Odiorn Point in Rye, 1623. So in the Piscataqua, we're getting ready for a big celebration in 1623. And in some ways, this book was like, and this exhibit was the first step in sort of saying like, hello, it isn't just Massachusetts in 1620. There's all this other stuff going on, absolutely. And in fact, actually, the Hilton brothers, when they come up, William is in Plymouth by 1623, and then his brother Edward shows up soon afterwards, and they're fishmongers from London originally, and that's why they come to the Piscataqua. Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah?
This is your archaeological question. It looks like there was a connection to Devon and the Dartmoor.
Yeah, that. You know, if I had another hour, you would have heard the Devon. Yes.
Devon, Milton Penn,
Yep.
chart.
Yep. extensive amounts of North Devon gravel tempered ceramics and North Devon sgraffito wares. We actually had Martha also make a replica sgraffito plate, yeah. And also too, we're the first site that we know of, again, like outside of like the Virginia and Newfoundland, where we found Totnes ware. And Totnes is about 10 miles up the river Dart from where the Shapleys lived. And in fact, actually, Lucy's grandfather and great-grandfather, I think it was, had been Lord Mayors of Totnes in the late 16th century. So again, West Country, not East Anglian, and I could talk about an hour or two about the architecture because they're not talking about hall and parlor, central chimney, East Anglian. In one case in Maine, we actually excavated an 80-foot long West Country longhouse with the cattle living in one end, the people living in the other. Yeah.
And then, of course, the names Portsmouth.
Right.
And then Gosport on the Isle of Shoals.
Exactly.
I'm from Piscataqua, actually.
Yep.
And Gosport is in Devon. Portsmouth is right across the harbor.
Yep.
Is Gosport, and I freaked out when I saw that.
And Biddeford Pool, likewise too, is a major fishing place on the coast of Biddeford as a pool. It's called Appledore Pool in Biddeford. Yeah. Yeah.
Is this exhibit still on display?
Well, you know, Nina and I kind of did this all by ourselves, including raising about $150,000 to do it. And so we didn't actually get the exhibit catalog out until after the exhibit was over. I'm sorry, you know. We wanted to get it sooner, but we just didn't. So that's the memory of it is the catalog, I'm afraid. But I'm hoping it'll come back in some other guises. And again, too, to me, it's like the start of this big book project that I'm working on too. Yeah. Yep.
Can you say a bit about when this reference to a Puritan New England first emerges, or when we start to think about New England as dominated by the Puritan narrative?
Wow, that's a good question, Frank, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a good question.
I'm not sure I have a good answer to it. I think it's always been sort of viewed just as, I think it goes sort of hand in hand, ironically, with the Mayflower and Plymouth Rock, which technically weren't Puritans, right?
This room after lunch, I'll come and ask the question.
All right.
I'll think of it.
Come back after lunch. Frank will answer your question much better than I could. Any other questions? Yes.
Where is Oyster River?
Oyster River is Durham, present-day Durham, and that again I think it was renamed Durham by all those Scottish guys who worked there in the sawmills and then were some of the first settlers there. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I sort of have a how-to question as an administrator. So if one has a bunch of cardboard boxes filled with not 17th century but 18th century artifacts,
Yep.
Can you tell me a good starting point for figuring out how to get the scholars and the money to
If I had that answer, I wouldn't tell you. It's again, it was well, it's a lot of backbreaking work and finding people who are interested in your project. I think we were helped by the Chadbourne Project because every year when we ran the dig, it was a public archaeology dig, and we had people invested in it in the community from the start, including, and it was an educational project with teachers and students. And every summer we'd have probably a couple hundred volunteers, and we did that for 13 seasons. So you've built up kind of like a constituency. And to me, it's a lot easier to have that than to sort of say, we got all these archaeology artifacts in the attic, what are we going to do with them, right? But I just will say too, is what we try to do in this exhibit is to use modern replicas. We have really some wonderful collectors around here who are willing to let us borrow the complete 17th century bits of ceramic, the complete 17th century chests. We might just have like a piece of a hinge or something like that. So that's one way from a purely interpretation point of view, that's the way to do it is to work with those, the Boston China Students Club, for example, for 18th century ceramics, if you were to do that, or to find what people are really heavily collecting into that time period. And we were actually lucky enough, that's one reason the exhibit didn't go up longer, was we said, could we just borrow this for this Dennis Searle chest, one of the few in private ownership, could we just borrow it for 18 months for this exhibit? And people were nice enough to do that, but they also wanted their stuff back after a point as well. Anything else? Thank you all. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, last question.
You said after 1692, north of Portsmouth basically cleared out because of Indian raids.
Okay, I will put an asterisk by that because I live in York, which did survive the famous Candlemas raid, but barely. But you have Portsmouth, and then once you cross the river into Maine, you have a scattering of people. They say no more than 5 or 10 houses were left in York. You have one house left in Wells, the store or garrison, which is almost attacked. It's just destroyed by 400 French and Native Americans. You have very, very little there. You do have those crazy individual people who will try to hang in there or to go back up on the coast. But in large part, and then there'll be peace in 1697. It's like a false peace that lasts until 1701. So some people will go back then leave again, and then they won't really be safe to go back until 1713 to Queen Anne. I'm sorry, what did you, so?
That was my question, when did people start filtering back in?
1713, and what you have in the meantime is this huge population of refugees who are coming down to places like Salem and Boston. And frankly, it's part of that refugee relief effort that also overtaxes people during the witch trials. It was a lot of folks who had come from the North Shore, from Salem, from Danvers, members of like the Ingersoll Tavern, for example, who had been moved up to Maine in the 1680s and then are just burnt out, and they have to come back home. And as I like to describe it, as imagine like, so here comes my sister-in-law with those 6 kids, and they got nothing but the clothes on the back, and that oldest one is a lout and lazy, and he eats like a horse, and I've got to find a job for him, and the tax rates just went up to pay for the war. These people were not happy with the situation. Nobody was. Thank you all very much. How'd that go? Yes, exactly. Yeah. I always like to see you guys put